The moment the fountain hiccuped and the brass cup slipped from mittened fingers, the water paused mid-ripple, then collapsed into a choking quiet. The cup hit stone, scattering ink-saturated feathers that splayed into a stained spiderweb, each plume pointing at the cracked pediment as if accusing. No one moved to retrieve them. The echo of the splash still hummed, refusing to settle, and the cup's lid kept spinning, whispering that something was very wrong. The city's breath resumed its accustomed cadence. Lanterns on the rim of the fountain hummed with steady blue, and the soft scrape of sandals on cobbles returned, punctuated by distant market calls that had nothing to do with the broken cup. A pair of apprentice scribes crouched beside the spattered stone, carefully nudging the feathered mess with gloved fingers, murmuring about ink viscosity and the absurdity of clumsy hands rather than whatever silence had just shivered through the square. The vaulted gallery overhead remained unchanged, its frescoes unreadable to most and endlessly familiar to the rest. Someone, likely the same incline of a shawl, lifted the spinning lid with a practiced flick, set it on the ledge, then drifted back into the bench's shadow without a glance. A boy delivering bread waded through the crowd, steadying his tray with a hip. The smell of yeast threaded past the fountain, carrying the usual rumors. A councilman's daughter marrying off-brand, and a cartwright promising faster wheels. Life, as always, moved in measured keens, the unspoken guilt a thin film where friendships met. Nobody dared cross it. Not now. Not in this deliberate pause. The kettle hissed shut. Mira dragged the towel across the table, scattering breakfast crumbs, then stopped with her hand hovering over the dented tin box where Jonas used to keep his sketches. Jonas stepped around her, palms damp. "You said you'd tell me if you were going to bail on the carpool," he said quietly, snagging the corner of the box. "You promised me at the garage door, Mira. The night before the show." Mira jerked. The towel slipped from her grip and clattered to the floor. She bent, scooped it up, and returned to wiping, the motion sharp as if sweeps could erase the memory. "I know," she replied, closing her eyes just long enough for the silhouette of the empty road to stretch through her mind. "It was the only way to keep the kids from arguing. I thought if I just told you afterwards, it would be fine." Jonas didn't let her finish. He set the box down with deliberate care and leaned his elbows on the table. "You didn't just keep me from arguing, Mira. You took the choice away from me. I spent 2 hours at the station because I thought you'd bail and I could plan for it." He breathed in, kept his voice low. "That's on me too. I didn't stand up and say, 'I need to know for sure.'" She lifted her head, pupils wide. "You're not the only one holding on to things," she snapped, then softened as his jaw tightened. "I kept it to myself because I didn't want to disappoint you twice. I thought if I could carry it alone, maybe you wouldn't have to feel it." She reached for the kettle, pulled the plug, and the silence stretched briefly. Jonas exhaled a laugh that was more rasp. "So, we're both still lying to ourselves. Great." Mira's fingers trembled around the handle. "I'm sorry for breaking that promise," she said, not looking at him. "And I'm sorry for hoping you wouldn't notice." Jonas leaned back, scraped the chair leg across the tile, the noise scratching the air. When he spoke again, his tone sharpened with a raw edge of relief. "Maybe it's not about blame anymore," he said, "but about how we kept each other from saying anything." His hand hovered over the box. "I can't pretend I didn't feel betrayed, and I won't pretend I know the right time to speak. I'll just speak." Jonas gave her a short, wry smile. "Then I'll try to listen before I fill the silence with my own fear." Neither statement was a cure, but each acted as a small release. The moment tightened and then loosened. The emotional peak, the acknowledgement that guilt was no longer a solo prisoner, but a shared room where both sat together, breathing in the same tight space. Outside the kitchen window, the first raindrop hit the pane, tracing a path downhill. Mira lifted the towel for the last sweep, watching the water bead, then turned to fold the napkins with Jonas. They moved in tandem, a little more slowly, their shoulders brushing without questions, just the simple, shared task of keeping the table ready for whatever came next. Lila pushed her chair back so hard the legs scraped the floor, and everyone flinched. She stood halfway, palms flat on the table, eyes darting over to Jonas, then Mira, then the rest of the circle. "I kept quiet about the weekends I was supposed to cover," she said fast, like she needed to get air in before the words disappeared. "Not because I thought it was harmless, but because every time I told myself I'd fix it later, I felt smaller. Like if I made it look like nothing, I could still be part of this." Her fingers curled into the edge of the table. Concealment didn't make guilt go away. It grew around whatever else I was trying to feel, until every call, every smile, felt like a lie. She stepped back, breathing hard, but not looking away. Mira slid forward, her hand hovering over Lila's for a moment before resting on the table. "You bought time," Mira said quietly, "but we all paid for it in silence. Shame was our curtain. We never knew what the others really needed." Jonas rubbed his thumb along the rim of the coffee mug, then lifted it like he was weighing a decision. Shame kept us from asking, from saying, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need me to step in?" He murmured, and the sentence cracked open the air. He didn't reach for Lila. He stayed at the edge of the table, because they both knew closeness could feel like pressure right now. Lila let out a short, sharp laugh. "You think admitting it will make me better?" she said, turning to Mira. "I don't know if it makes anything except louder. But now you all know. It's not hiding anymore." She glanced at the others, and her voice lowered. "I need to rebuild boundaries that got covered in guilt. I need time to stop measuring everything I say by how much shame it avoids." Her shoulders slumped, but her chin lifted a fraction, and the shift was visible. Jonas leaned forward enough that everyone heard the scrape of his elbow against wood. "Then we start with clarity," he said. "We stop trying to protect each other from the truth because we think the truth will hurt. It already did, in silence." He met Mira's eyes, and she nodded sharply. "No forgiveness now," he added. "Bare fact. No apology in it. But we can stop lying to ourselves about what's been broken. We can start naming it." The circle hummed. Mira opened her mouth, about to say something, but Lila cut in. "I'll take the shifts I owe," Lila said, standing again, sleeves rolled, eyes bright with moving urgency. "I won't pretend I'm fine when I'm not, and I'm done pretending you all can't see it." She reached for the schedule, sliding it closer to Jonas. "Maybe it isn't fixed yet, but at least it's written down." Jonas tapped the paper with his thumb, then signed a line beside her name. He laid the pen down, then looked up. "Shame doesn't get the last word this time," he said. And though the words weren't forgiveness, they were a promise to keep naming the damage as long as it took. Mira exhaled, the sound sharp and releasing. "We keep asking," she said. "Even when the answers hurt." She knocked her knuckles lightly on the table, concrete enough that it felt like a pact. The air tightened, then loosened slightly. Because for the first time, the group didn't pretend the trust was intact. They saw the cracks, but they also saw each other across them. Jonas flipped the calendar over with a sharp gesture, the paper rasping like a held-back breath. He tapped February 12th with his knuckle and pushed it toward Mira and Lila. We keep pointing at that day, he said, but we stopped looking at what it did to us. Guilt wasn't just a thing we carried. It started talking for us. Every time I asked a question, I heard it answering first. It told me to stay back, to stop expecting anything beyond what it already knew. I let it be the voice of my identity. His thumb circled the date again, slow and deliberate. Lila pulled a yellow legal pad toward her, her fingers leaving soft crescents in the ink. She ran her hand along the list of things she never said, then pushed it away with a flat palm. That's how I became the one who interrupts with facts before anyone can get close, she snapped, the pad jumping from the table. The guilt turned me into a wall that named every boundary as betrayal. I'm tired of being defensive just because I was afraid of being blamed. I'm not brave enough to welcome you without naming what I broke first. She stared at Jonas, eyes sharp. I know I became a stranger while still standing in this room. Mira, still holding a mug, let out a laugh that squealed at the edges. She set the mug down hard enough for the table to protest. You're saying all of us are walking around defensive or gone quiet because guilt rewired us? Her voice dropped. She leaned forward, both hands on the wood. I kept thinking love could survive without fixing what made us lie. But I'm scared now. If we don't lay these pieces out, it's not love anymore. It's just survival with the weight of what we never owned up to. That weight keeps me from breathing near Jonas without bracing for judgment or silence. Her gaze shifted between them. I'm afraid love is just a wish, unless we do this. Jonas glanced at the legal pad, then at the calendar. He stood, moved to the bookshelf, and pulled down a worn notebook, its spine cracked from use. He set it on the table and opened to a page already scribed with dates and tiny check marks. We're not hiding anything anymore, he said. So here's what we do. We write down the guilt when it speaks. We name what it says we did wrong, and we name the truth that needs saying in its place, not to absolve it, but to refuse its authority. He handed the notebook to Mira. You write first, then Lila, then me. We read it aloud. If it needs to be said again, we say it. Then, we keep showing up, even when we're defensive. That's the work. Not forgiveness yet, but transparency. Lila took the notebook, fingers trembling just above the paper. She wrote, then read. I hid the truth because I thought shame would shrink if I kept quiet. It only grew, so now I'm going to name it every time it tries to speak before I do. Her voice cracked on the last sentence, but she kept going. Mira nodded and added her own entry about the schedule change. No excuses, just facts. Jonas wrote about the silence he let guilt enforce. When they finished, the room felt heavier, but also lighter, because the guilt no longer had space to curl between them without being addressed. Mira dropped the pen and exhaled sharply, a release of air that sounded like a promise. I can't say we're past it, she said, but there was steadiness. I can say we're not letting it dictate what love looks like. Lila folded her hands around the notebook, fingers still white, and muttered, That's the only thing keeping me here. Jonas placed his hand over the closed book and didn't pull away. The notebook stayed between them when the lights dimmed. No one said it was fixed, but they each reached for the pen when guilt moved again, not to silence it, but to write it down and share it aloud. That act, small and deliberate, became their new language. Light from the window sliced across the table where the notebook lay open, pages already scribbled with guilt statements. Mira reached for a pen before anyone else could speak and wrote, I kept us moving instead of asking what you needed. Then slid the pad toward Jonas, keeping her fingers on the edge as if to anchor herself. This is me deciding not to let the silence between us grow, she said. words clipped but steady. She didn't wait for a response. She gathered the sheets, tore off the top page, and handed them to Lila. "Read it aloud," she added, laying a palm flat on the page as if to hold herself there. Lila uncurled the paper, breath shaking. She didn't look up. Her voice didn't soften. The tension was in the lines of her jaw. "I let guilt make me either cling or step back," she said. And the room flinched as she let the words land. She dragged a hand over her scalp, fingers tangled in her hair before she reached for her own pen and underlined "cling." Then the next line. "I want to try something different. I want to name every time I feel that pull so it doesn't spill into the next exchange." Jonas leaned forward, elbows on the tabletop. "And what does that look like?" he asked, tapping the notebook where a fresh line of ink bled. "Because saying it out loud isn't the same as showing it." Mira looked at him, then the notebook, then him again. "I'm staying in this room tonight. I'm not leaving until we write down a promise for each time I let guilt tell me to shut down," she said. "That might mean calling you when you're not around just to say I'm checking in before I bail into silence. It might mean letting you ask for clarity and answering without redirecting." She slid a folded list across the table. Jonas opened it, read, then nodded once, sharply. Lila's fingers drummed the tabletop. Her eyes flicked to Jonas and back to Mira. "And I'll take the notebook at midnight," she said. "I'll write the guilt statements before I try to explain them. No defense, no justification. Just the fact that I'm drawing back. Then I'll call you, Jonas, and ask if you need space or if my guilt is trying to make you handle things alone again." She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. Jonas stood, stepping away from the table, then stopped halfway to the door. He clenched and unclenched his fists once, then put them on the table. "You both want redemption," he said low, "but I need to know what it costs me. I'm not forgiving you tonight, and you can't expect that to change without seeing the shift. Show me the boundaries you're constructing with guilt instead of letting it crash through them." Mira leaned in until their foreheads nearly touched, murmuring, "We'll keep writing those boundaries. We'll set alarms to text them to you when we feel the pull. We can start with tonight. Call you every time we feel like running away." Jonas nodded, just barely, and took Mira's hand for a second. Lila stepped closer, placed her palm over Mira's hand, and then over Jonas's, keeping the contact long enough to feel the promise settle. Jonas let go, but he inscribed a final note in the notebook. "Call me, even if you think I'm asleep. Name the guilt. Don't wait for me to chase you." He closed the notebook, tapped it once, and then set it between them like a shared pulse. A small burst of relief rippled through the room. A payoff. Guilt no longer a silent undercurrent, but a signal they must all answer. The air hummed with tension, but also with a fragile plan. Lila gathered the notebook, a new page ready. She took a deep breath, looked at Jonas, and said, "I'm not hiding behind what I did anymore. I'm naming the guilt as the thing that makes me push away, and I'll show up to the boundary you set." Jonas didn't look convinced yet, but he didn't leave. Mira squeezed Lila's shoulder, then released. The night stretched forward, the notebook closed but humming with ink, each promise a tiny beacon of the measurable effort they now owed to one another. The notebook lay open on the coffee table, pages already dotted with phrases in different hands. Mira slid a fresh sheet beneath Jonas's pen. She didn't look up as she tapped the pen twice against the paper, then placed it in Jonas's grip. "Write what we agreed," she said, fingers still resting on the edge of the table. "Or the hurt gets shaped by silence again." Jonas inked a single sentence. I let guilt mutate into self-hatred instead of naming the damage, and passed the notebook to Lila. She flipped it, glanced at her own earlier entry, then set the pen down with a deep exhale. I read that guilt cycle aloud, she said, and hearing it with you two there took the sting out of accusing myself in private. She tapped the words she had just spoken. I keep blaming myself for being the needy one, so I shut you out before forgiveness even had a chance. Mira's hand lifted from the tabletop to draw a circle around the line. Jonas leaned back, watching her. That's stopping itself before you could try. He pushed himself upright with both hands, the movement sharp enough to still the hum of the street outside for a second. We keep looping because we pretend guilt is a badge of effort, he said, voice low but immediate. It's not forgiveness when we keep waiting for the other person to soothe our shame. I'm not handing over pardon until you both tell me when guilt is on your tongue before it becomes a wall. He pointed at Mira without meaning to be accusatory, but the tension crackled like static. Mira's shoulders rose, then lengthened. I was locking myself in the stairwell, replaying Jonas's disappointment, telling myself I deserved both silence and distance. She slid her palm under the notebook, spreading to keep it from sliding. That is the cycle. Guilt leads to quieter rooms lead to the same guilt. I want to end it tonight, right now. I'll call Jonas the minute guilt swallows me before I even think about disappearing. Lila swallowed, her fingers drumming the cover of the notebook. I was letting guilt take over my words before I even finished the sentence, she said. I'd keep apologizing for needing space, then hating myself for needing space, and so on. She lifted her hand, fingers pressed together. From now on, I speak it aloud first. I'm feeling guilty because... Then I wait for you to hear me. That way the guilt can't reform into a defense before you know what I'm actually facing. Jonas exhaled slowly. Fine, he said. But if it stays hidden, you leave me no choice but to check out. I need to know it exists before it turns into something else. We confront guilt together, even if it doesn't fix love overnight. Mira leaned forward, leaned her forehead against her folded arms briefly before straightening. Even if the love we had can never come back whole, she said. This is the only way we grow without trapping ourselves in guilt. Lila nodded, both hands gripping the edge of the table as if grounding herself in the moment. Mira picked up the notebook again and wrote in steadier letters. Tell Jonas within 10 minutes when guilt hits. Lila copied the line underneath with her own looping script, Jonas watching as both of them sealed it with a firm tap of the pen. The page snapped shut, but the space above the table vibrated with the new agreement. Jonas reached for his phone, hit record on a voice memo, and spoke. Guilt check-in. Hear me now before you guilt yourself into hiding. Mira and Lila mirrored the motion, each hitting record before the sentence finished, a small proof that confrontation, not silence, would move them forward. The room smelled faintly of coffee and a whiteboard eraser. Jonas slid the shared notebook toward the center of the table, his fingers brushing the cover with the same intent he used when he recorded a voice memo. Lila pulled a page from inside, the ink already written in quick, heavy strokes. Tonight, I caught the guilt creeping in while Jonas was describing the plan for the weekend. And instead of saying nothing, I grabbed my pen within 5 minutes, she said. She left the sentence hanging, breath loud enough that Mira looked up from tightening the knot on a new ribbon-bound page. It is not yet forgiveness, but it changes how I see myself. Naming it makes me a person who doesn't hide the fracture anymore. Jonas nodded, not softening but acknowledging the change in her stance, the hard edge now pointing outward instead of inward. That honesty opens a crease where trust can fit. Mira added, lifting her hand to trace the rim of the notebook. Because gymnastic apologies stayed blank. And this language is the first in months we can both hear without recoiling. Lila read the sentence aloud again, then said, I called Jonas as soon as it hit me. I said, I know I'm silencing myself. Jonas pressed. What did I hear that was different from before? She looked at him, fingers tapping a rhythm on the table. I didn't defend, I said. I'm choosing that tension over the old comfort of pretending nothing's wrong. The air tightened, no physical blow, but a question about whether she could keep choosing that tension. Mira leaned forward, palm flat, and said, Let guilt change your shape. If you go back inside the walls, we go back to pretending. Jonas slid his phone onto the table. He hit play, and the voice memo labeled Guilt Check-In played his own clipped sentence. I'm afraid you're closing off. Lila closed her eyes halfway through, then opened them, brighter. The memo ended with him asking for a signal earlier next time. We don't stop tonight, he said, voice even but steady. It's not just, I'll text you when guilt shows up. Write the signal. Say what it is. Then say how you'd like me to respond. Mira reached for one of the gel pens, scribbling a new entry before anyone could stop her. I will call Jonas the minute I catch guilt flirting with my silence, she said aloud, pushing the page toward Jonas. Lila did the same. Her entry described the exact moment she would stop herself. They placed the notebook between them, like a newly forged pact. Jonas set the minutes on the counter for a shared check-in the next evening, the little timer clicking audibly. We keep this practice after today, Mira said, a small smile cracking her lips. Not because we have to, but because it keeps us honest enough for trust to grow. The timer buzzed, and Lila laughed, the tension easing into a reward. Their rhythm, messy but moving them forward. They all leaned toward the round table, the notebook open to a page thick with inked guilt, the graphite veins catching the amber from the lamp. Jonas pressed play. The voice memo crackled, the familiar cadence of guilt check-in, filling the kitchen like a bell that could not be unstruck. Mira's hand hovered over the page, then settled on the words she promised to live. Boundary promises, nightly calls, staying through the long hours when silence tempted her. Lila, fingers curled around the coffee cup, let her confession fall raw before explanation, the sentence that named the silence before it could harden. She said the truth aloud, the same truth that once fed her defense, now a sign in the notebook beside Jonas's own line about refusing quick forgiveness and needing signals. The timer for tomorrow's check-in ticked softly under the table, a promise that could not be unmade. Outside, the world went on. But inside, the air had changed. There was no stepping back into quiet ignorance, only this new, irrevocable naming that would haunt them until it did not.